ancient days, when communication was even more difficult than at present, and especially during the feudal period, this difference in thought was most pronounced. The art and poetry of the one breathes an atmosphere entirely distinct from that of the other. In Lao Tzu and his followers, and in Kutsugen, the forerunner of the Yangtze Gang nature poets, we find an idealism quite inconsistent with the prosaic ethical notions of their contemporary northern writers. Lao Tzu lived 5 centuries before the Christian era. The germ of Taoist speculation may be found long before the advent of Lao Tzu, surnamed the Long-Eared. The archaic records of China, especially the Book of Changes, foreshadow his thought. But the great respect paid to the laws and customs of that classic period of Chinese civilization, which culminated with the establishment of the Zhou dynasty in the 16th century BC, kept the development of individualism in check for a long while, so that it was not until after the disintegration of the Zhou dynasty and the establishment of innumerable independent kingdoms that it was able to blossom forth in the luxuriance of free thought. Lao Tzu and Soshi Zhuangzi were both Southerners and the greatest exponents of the new school. On the other hand, Confucius, with his numerous disciples, aimed at retaining ancestral conventions. Taoism cannot be understood without some knowledge of Confucianism and vice versa. We have said that the Taoist absolute was the relative. In ethics, the Taoists railed at the laws and the moral codes of society, for to them right and wrong were but relative terms. Definition is always limitation. The fixed and unchangeless are but terms expressive of a stoppage of growth. Said Kutsugen, the sages move the world. Our standards of morality are begotten of the past needs of society, but is society to remain always the same? The observance of communal traditions involves a constant sacrifice of the individual to the state. Education, in order to keep up the mighty delusion, encourages a species of ignorance. People are not taught to be really virtuous, but to behave properly. We are wicked because we are frightfully self-conscious. We nurse a conscience because we are afraid to tell the truth to others. We take refuge in pride because we are afraid to tell the truth to ourselves. How can one be serious with the world when the world itself is so ridiculous? The spirit of barter is everywhere, honor and chastity. Behold the complacent salesman retailing the good and true. One can even buy a so-called religion, which is really but common morality sanctified with flowers and music. Rob the church of her accessories and what remains behind. Yet the trusts thrive marvelously, for the prices are absurdly cheap. A prayer for a ticket to heaven, a diploma for an honorable citizenship. Hide yourselves under a bushel quickly, for if your real usefulness were known to the world, you would soon be knocked down to the highest bidder by the public auctioneer. Why do men and women like to advertise themselves so much? Is it not but an instinct derived from the days of slavery? The virility of the idea lies not less in its power breaking through contemporary thought than in its capacity for dominating subsequent movements. Taoism was an active power during the Shin dynasty, that epoch of Chinese unification from which we derive the name China. It would be interesting, had we time, to note its influence on contemporary thinkers, the mathematicians, writers on law and war, the mystics and alchemists, and the later nature poets of the Yangtze Gang. We should not even ignore these speculators on reality who doubted whether a white horse was real because he was white or because he was solid, nor the conversationalists of the 6 dynasties who, like the Zen philosophers, reveled in discussions concerning the pure and the abstract. Above all, we should pay homage to Taoism for what it has done toward the formation of the celestial character, giving to it a certain capacity for reserve and refinement, and warm as jade. Chinese Chinese history is full of instances in which the votaries of Taoism, princes and hermits alike, have followed with varied and interesting results the teachings of their creed. The tale will not be without its quota of instruction and amusement. It will be rich in anecdotes, allegories, and aphorisms. We would fain be on speaking terms with the delightful emperor who never died because he had never lived. We may ride the wind with Li Tzu and find it absolutely quiet because we ourselves are the wind, or dwell in midair with the aged one, the Huang Ho, who lived betwixt heaven and earth because he was subject to neither the one nor the other. Even in that grotesque apology for Taoism which we find in China at the present day, we can revel in a wealth of imagery impossible to find in any other cult. But the chief contribution of Taoism to Asiatic life has been in the realm of aesthetics. Chinese historians have always spoken of Taoism as the art of being in the world, for it deals with the present, ourselves. It is in us that God meets with nature, and yesterday parts from tomorrow. The present is the moving infinity, the legitimate sphere of the relative. Relativity seeks adjustment. Adjustment is art. The art of life lies in a constant readjustment to our surroundings. Taoism accepts the mundane as it is, and, unlike the Confucians or the Buddhists, tries to find beauty in our world of woe and worry. The sung allegory of the three vinegar tasters explains admirably the trend of the three doctrines. Sakyamuni, Confucius, and Lao Tzu once stood before a jar of vinegar, the emblem of life, and each dipped in his finger to taste the brew. The matter-of-fact Confucius found it sour. The Buddha called it bitter, and Lao Tzu pronounced it sweet. The Taoists claimed that the comedy of life could be made more interesting if everyone would preserve the unities, to keep the proportion of things and give place to others without losing one's own position was the secret of success in the mundane drama. We must know the whole play in order to properly act our parts. The conception of totality must never be lost in that of the individual. This Lao Tzu illustrates by his favorite metaphor of the vacuum. He claimed that only in vacuum lay the truly essential. The reality of a room, for instance, was to be found in the vacant space enclosed by the roof and the walls, not in the roof and walls themselves. The usefulness of a water pitcher dwelt in the emptiness where water might be put, not in the form of the pitcher or the material of which it was made. Vacuum is all potent because all containing. In vacuum alone, motion becomes possible. One who could make of himself a vacuum into which others might freely enter would become master of all situations. The whole can always dominate the part. These Taoists' ideals have greatly influenced all our theories of action, even to those of fencing and wrestling. Jiu-Jitsu, the Japanese art of self-defense, owes its name to a passage in the Tao Te Ching. In Jiu-Jitsu, one seeks to draw out and exhaust the enemy's strength by non-resistance, vacuum, while conserving one's own strength for victory in the final struggle. In art, the importance of the same principle is illustrated by the value of suggestion. In leaving something unsaid, the beholder is given a chance to complete the idea, and thus a great masterpiece irresistibly rivets your attention until you seem to become actually a part of it. A vacuum is there for you to enter and fill up the full measure of your aesthetic emotion. He who had made himself master of the art of living was the real man of the Taoist. At birth, he enters the realm of dreams only to awaken to reality at death. He tempers his own brightness in order to merge himself into the obscurity of others. He is reluctant as one who crosses a stream in winter, hesitating as one who fears the neighborhood, respectful like a guest, trembling like ice that is about to melt, unassuming like a piece of wood not yet carved, vacant like a valley, formless like troubled waters. To him, the three jewels of life were pity, economy, and modesty. If now we turn our attention to Zenism, we shall find that it emphasizes the teachings of Taoism. Zen is a name derived from the Sanskrit word dhyana, which signifies meditation. It claims that through consecrated meditation may be attained supreme self-realization. Meditation is one of the 6 ways through which Buddhahood may be reached, and the Zen sectarians affirm that Sakyamuni laid special stress on this method in his later teachings, handing down the rules to his chief disciple, Geshe. According to their tradition, Geshe, the first Zen patriarch, imparted the secret to Ananda, who in turn passed it on to successive patriarchs until it reached Bodhidharma, the 28th. Bodhidharma came to northern China in the early half of the 6th century and was the first patriarch of Chinese Zen. There is much uncertainty about the history of these patriarchs and their doctrines. In its philosophical aspect, early Zenism seems to have affinity, on one hand, to the Indian negativism of Nagarjuna, and on the other to the Nan philosophy formulated by Sachara. The first teaching of Zen, as we know it at the present day, must be attributed to the 6th Chinese patriarch Yino, 637 to 713, founder of Southern Zen, so called from the fact of its predominance in southern China. He is closely followed by the great Baso, who died in 788, who made of Zen a living influence in celestial life. Haikujo, 719 to 814. The people of Baso first instituted the Zen monastery and established a ritual and regulations for its government. In the discussions of the Zen school after the time of Baso, we find the play of the Yang mind causing an ascension of native modes of thought in contrast to the former Indian idealism. Whatever sectarian pride may assert to the contrary, one cannot help being impressed by the similarity of Southern Zen to the teachings of Lao Tzu and the Taoist conversationalists. In the Tao Te Ching, we already found allusions to the importance of self-concentration and the need of properly regulating the breath, essential points in the practice of Zen meditation. Some of the best commentaries on the Book of Lao Tzu have been written by Zen scholars. Zenism, like Taoism, is the worship of relativity. One master defines Zen as the art of feeling the polar star in the southern sky. Truth can be reached only through the comprehension of opposites. Again, Zenism, like Taoism, is a strong advocate of individualism. Nothing is real except that which concerns the working of our own minds. The 6th patriarch, once saw 2 monks watching the flag of a pagoda fluttering in the wind. One said, "It is the wind that moves." The other said, "It is the flag that moves." But Yino explained to them that the real movement was neither of the wind nor the flag, but of something within their own minds. Haikujo was walking in the forest with a disciple when a hare scurried off at their approach. "Why does the hare fly from you?" asked Haikujo. "Because he is afraid of me," was the answer. "No," said the master. "It is because you have murderous instinct." The dialogue recalls that of Soshi, Chuanzi, the Taoist. One day Soshi was walking on the bank of a river with a friend. "How delightfully the fishes are enjoying themselves in the water," exclaimed Soshi. His friend spake to him thus, "You are not a fish. How do you know that the fishes are enjoying themselves?" "You are not myself," returned Soshi. "How do you know that I do not know that the fishes are enjoying themselves?" Zen was often opposed to the precepts of Orthodox Buddhism, even as Taoism was opposed to Confucianism. To the transcendental insight of the Zen, words were but an encumbrance to thought. The whole sway of Buddhist scriptures only commentaries on personal speculation. The followers of Zen aimed at direct communication with the inner nature of things, regarding their outward accessories only as impediments to a clear perception of truth. It was this love of the abstract that led the Zen to prefer black and white sketches to the elaborately colored paintings of the classic Buddhist school. Some of the Zen even became iconoclastic as a result of their endeavor to recognize the Buddha in themselves rather than through images and symbolism. We find Tanka Osho breaking up a wooden statue of Buddha on a wintry day to make a fire. What sacrilege, said the horror-stricken bystander. I wish to get the shali out of the ashes, Campley rejoined the Zen. But you certainly will not get shali from this image, was the angry retort. To which Tanka replied, if I do not, this is certainly not a Buddha, and I am committing no sacrilege. Then he turned to warm himself over the kindling fire. A special contribution of Zen to Eastern thought was its recognition of the mundane as of equal importance with the spiritual. It held that in the great relation of things there was no distinction of small and great, an atom possessing equal possibilities with the universe. The seeker for perfection must discover in his own life the reflection of the inner light. The organization of the Zen monastery was very significant of this point of view. To every member, except the abbot, was assigned some special work in the caretaking of the monastery, and curiously enough, to the novices was committed the lighter duties, while to the most respected and advanced monks were given the more irksome and menial tasks. Such services formed a part of the Zen discipline, and every least action must be done absolutely perfectly. Thus, many a weighty discussion ensued while weeding the garden, paring a turnip, or serving tea. The whole ideal of teaism is a result of this Zen conception of greatness in the smallest incidents of life. Taoism furnished the basis for aesthetic ideals. Zenism made them practical. 4. The tea room. To European architects, brought up on the traditions of stone and brick construction, our Japanese method of building with wood and bamboo seems scarcely worthy to be ranked as architecture. It is but quite recently that a competent student of Western architecture has recognized and paid tribute to the remarkable perfection of our great temples. Such being the case as regards our classic architecture, we could hardly expect the outsider to appreciate the subtle beauty of the tea room, its principles of construction and decoration being entirely different from those of the West. The tea room, the sukiya, does not pretend to be other than a mere cottage, a straw hut, as we call it. The original ideographs for sukiya meant the abode of fancy. Latterly, the various tea masters constituted various Chinese characters according to their conception of the tea room, and the term sukiya may signify the abode of vacancy or the abode of the unsymmetrical. It is an abode of fancy inasmuch as it is an ephemeral structure built to house a poetic impulse. It is an abode of vacancy inasmuch as it is devoid of ornamentation except for what may be placed in it to satisfy some aesthetic need of the moment. It is an abode of the unsymmetrical inasmuch as it is consecrated to the worship of the imperfect, purposely leaving something unfinished for the play of the imagination to complete. The ideals of teaism have since the 16th century influenced our architecture to such degree that the ordinary Japanese interior of the present day, on account of the extreme simplicity and chasteness of its scheme of decoration, appears to foreigners almost barren. The first independent tea room was the creation of Senno Soiki, commonly known by his later name of Rikyu, the greatest of all tea masters, who, in the 16th century, under the patronage of Taiko Hideyoshi, instituted and brought to a high state of perfection the formalities of the tea ceremony. The properties of the tea room had been previously determined by Jalo, a famous tea master of the 15th century. The early tea room consisted merely of a portion of the ordinary drawing room partitioned off by screens for the purpose of the tea gathering. The portion partitioned off was called the kakyo enclosure, a name terms still apply to those tea rooms which are built into a house and are not independent construction. The sukiya consists of the tea room proper, designed to accommodate not more than 5 persons, a number suggestive of the saying, more than the graces and less than the muses. An anteroom, mitsuya, where the tea utensils are washed and arranged before being brought in. A portico, machai, in which the guests wait until they receive the summons to enter the tea room. And a garden path, the roji, which connects the magai with the tea room. The tea room is unimpressive in appearance. It is smaller than the smallest of Japanese houses, while the materials used in its construction are intended to give the suggestion of refined poverty. Yet we must remember that all this is the result of profound artistic forethought, and that the details have been worked out with care perhaps even greater than that expended on the building of the richest palaces and temples. A good tea room is more costly than an ordinary mansion, for the selection of its materials, as well as its workmanship, requires immense care and precision. Indeed, the carpenters employed by the tea masters form a distinct and highly honored class among artisans, their work being no less delicate than that of the makers of lacquer cabinets. The tea room is not only different from any production of Western architecture, but also contrasts strongly with the classical architecture of Japan itself. Our ancient noble edifices, whether secular or ecclesiastical, were not to be despised even as regards their mere size. The few that have been spared in the disastrous conflagrations of centuries are still capable of awing us by the grandeur and richness of their decoration. Huge pillars of wood from 2 to 3 feet in diameter and from 30 to 40 feet high, supported by a complicated network of brackets, the enormous beams which groaned under the weight of the tile-covered roofs. The material and mode of construction, though weak against fire, provided itself strong against earthquakes, and was well suited to the climatic conditions of the country. In the Golden Hall of Horyuji and the Pagoda of Yakushiji, we have noteworthy examples of the durability of our wooden structure. These buildings have practically stood intact for nearly 12 centuries. The interior of the old temples and palaces was profusely decorated. In the Udu Temple of Uchi, dating from the 10th century, we can still see the elaborate canopy and gilded baldacchinos, many-colored and inlaid with mirrors and mother-of-pearl, as well as remains of the paintings and sculpture which formerly covered the walls. Later, at Nikko and in the Nicho Castle in Kyoto, we see structural beauty sacrificed to a wealth of ornamentation which in color and exquisite detail equals the utmost gorgeousness of Arabian or Moorish effort. The simplicity and purism of the tea room resulted from emulation of the Zen monastery. A Zen monastery differs from those of other Buddhist sects inasmuch as it is meant only to be a dwelling place for the monks. Its chapel is not a place of worship or pilgrimage, but a college room where the students congregate for discussion and the practice of meditation. The room is bare except for a central alcove in which, behind the altar, is a statue of Bodhidharma, the founder of the sect, or of Sakyamuni, attended by Kapaipa and Ananda, the 2 earliest Zen patriarchs. On the altar, flowers and incense are offered up in the memory of the great contributions which these sages made to Zen. We have already said that it was the ritual instituted by the Zen monks of successively drinking tea out of a bowl before the image of Bodhidharma, which laid the foundations of the tea ceremony. We might add here that the altar of the Zen chapel was the prototype of the Tokonoma, the place of honor in a Japanese room where paintings and flowers are placed for the edification of the guests. All our great tea masters were students of Zen and attempted to introduce the spirit of Zennism into the actualities of life. Thus, the room, like the other equipments of the tea ceremony reflects many of the Zen doctrines. The size of the orthodox tea room, which is 4 mats and a half or 10 feet square, is determined by a passage in the Sutra Vikramaditya. In that interesting work, Vikramaditya welcomes the Saint Maharishi and 84,000 disciples of Buddha in a room of this size, an allegory based on the theory of the non-existence of space to the truly enlightened. Again, the Roji, the garden path which leads from the Machai to the tea room, signifies the first stage of meditation, the passage into self-illumination. The Roji was intended to break connection with the outside world and produce a fresh sensation conducive to the full enjoyment of aestheticism in the tea room itself. One who has trodden this garden path cannot fail to remember how his spirit, as he walked in the twilight of evergreens over the regular irregularities of the stepping stone, beneath which lay dried pine needles, and passed beside the moss-covered granite lanterns, became uplifted above ordinary thoughts. One may be in the midst of a city, and yet feel as if he were in the forest far away from the dust and din of civilization. Great was the ingenuity displayed by the tea masters in producing these efforts of serenity and purity. The nature of the sensations to be aroused in passing through the Roji differed with different tea masters. Some, like Raikyū, aimed at utter loneliness and claimed the secret of making a Roji was contained in the ancient ditty, "I look beyond. Flowers are not, nor tinted leaves. On the sea beach, a solitary cottage stands in the waning light of an autumn eve." Others, like Gabori Enshu, sought for a different effect. Enshu said the idea of the garden path was to be found in the following verses: a cluster of summer trees, a bit of the sea, a pale evening moon. It is not difficult to gather his meaning. He wished to create the attitude of a newly awakened soul still lingering amid shadowy dreams of the past, yet bathing in the sweet unconsciousness of a mellow spiritual light, and yearning for the freedom that lay in the expanse beyond. Thus prepared, the guest will silently approach the sanctuary, and if a samurai will leave his sword on the rack beneath the eaves, the tea room being preeminently the house of peace, then he will bend low and creep into the room through a small door not more than 3 feet in height. This proceeding was incumbent on all guests, high and low alike, and was intended to inculcate humility. The order of precedence having been mutually agreed upon while resting in the Machai, the guests one by one will enter noiselessly and take their seats, first making obeisance to the picture or flower arrangement on the tokonoma. The host will not enter the room until all the guests have seated themselves and quiet reigns, with nothing to break the silence save the note of the boiling water in the iron kettle. The kettle sings well, for pieces of iron are so arranged in the bottom as to produce a peculiar melody, in which one may hear the echoes of a cataract muffled by clouds, of a distant sea breaking among the rocks, a rainstorm sweeping through a bamboo forest, or of the soughing of pines on some faraway hill. Even in the daytime, the light in the room is subdued, for the low eaves of the slanting roof admit but few of the sun's rays. Everything is sober intent from the ceiling to the floor. The guests themselves have carefully chosen garments of unobtrusive colors. The mellowness of age is over all. Everything suggestive of recent acquirement, being tabooed save only the one note of contrast furnished by the bamboo dipper and the linen napkin, both immaculately white and new. However faded the tea room and the tea equipage may seem, everything is absolutely clean. Not a particle of dust will be found in the darkest corner, for if any exists, the host is not a tea master. One of the first requisites of a tea master is the knowledge of how to sweep, clean, and wash, for there is an art in cleaning and dusting. A piece of antique metalwork must not be attacked by the unscrupulous zeal of the Dutch housewife. Dripping water from a flower vase need not be wiped away, for it may be suggestive of dew and coolness. In this connection, there is a story of Rikiu which well illustrates the ideas of cleanliness entertained by the tea masters. Rikiu was watching his son Sean as he swept and watered the garden path. "Not clean enough," said Rikiu, when Sean had finished his task, and bade him try again. After a weary hour, the son returned to Rikiu. "Father, there is nothing more to be done. The steps have been washed for the third time. The stone lanterns in the trees are well sprinkled with water. Moss and lichens are shining with a fresh verdure. Not a twig, not a leaf have I left on the ground." "Young fool," chided the tea master. "That is not the way a garden path should be swept." Saying this, Rikiu stepped into the garden, shook a tree, and scattered over the garden gold and crimson leaves, scraps of the brocade of autumn. What Rikiu demanded was not cleanliness alone, but the beautiful and the natural also. The name, Abode of Fancy, implies a structure created to meet some individual artistic requirement. The tea room is made for the tea master, not the tea master for the tea room. It is not intended for posterity and is therefore ephemeral. The idea that everyone should have a house of his own is based on an ancient custom of the Japanese race, Shinto superstition ordaining that every dwelling should be evacuated on the death of its chief occupant. Perhaps there may have been some unrealized sanitary reason for this practice. Another early custom was that a newly built house should be provided for each couple that is married. On account of such customs that we find the imperial capitals so frequently removed from one site to another in ancient days. The rebuilding every 20 years of Is Temple, the supreme shrine of the sun goddess, is an example of one of these ancient rites which still obtain at the present day. The observance of these customs was only possible with some form of construction as that furnished by our system of wooden architecture, easily pulled down, easily built up. A more lasting style employing brick and stone would have rendered migrations impractical, as indeed it became when the more stable and massive wooden construction of China was adopted by us after the Nara period. With the predominance of Zen individualism in the 15th century, however, the old idea became imbued with a deeper significance, as conceived in connection with the tea room. Zenism, with the Buddhist theory of evanescence and its demands for the mastery of spirit over matter, recognized the house only as a temporary refuge for the body. The body itself was but a hut in the wilderness, a flimsy shelter made by tying together the grasses that grew around. When these ceased to be bound together, they again became resolved into the original waste. In the tea room, fugitiveness is suggested in the thatched roof, frailty in the slender pillars, lightness in the bamboo support, apparent carelessness in the use of commonplace materials. The eternal is to be found only in the spirit which, embodied in these simple surroundings, beautifies them with the subtle light of its refinement. That the tea room should be built to suit some individual taste is an enforcement of the principle of vitality in art. Art, to be fully appreciated, must be true to contemporaneous life. It is not that we should ignore the claims of posterity, but that we should seek to enjoy the present more. It is not that we should disregard the creations of the past, but that we should try to assimilate them into our consciousness. Slavish conformity to traditions and formulas fetters the expression of ingenious imitations of European buildings which one beholds in modern Japan. We marvel why, among the most progressive Western nations, architecture should be so devoid of originality, so replete with repetitions of obsolete styles. Perhaps we are passing through an age of democratization in art while awaiting the rise of some princely master who shall establish a new dynasty. Would that we loved the ancients more and copied them less. It has been said that the Greeks were great because they never drew from the antique. The term abode of vacancy, besides conveying the Taoist theory of the all-containing, involves the conception of a continued need of change and decorative motives. The tea room is absolutely empty, except for what may be placed there temporarily to satisfy some aesthetic mood. Some special art object is brought in for the occasion, and everything else is selected and arranged to enhance the beauty of the principal theme. One cannot listen to different pieces of music at the same time, a real comprehension of the beautiful being possible only through concentration upon some central motive. Thus it will be seen that the system of decoration in our tea rooms is opposed to that which obtains in the West, where the interior of a house is often converted into a museum. To a Japanese, accustomed to simplicity of ornamentation and frequent change of decorative method, a Western interior permanently filled with a vast array of pictures, statuary, and bric-a-brac gives the impression of mere vulgar display of riches. It calls for a mighty wealth of appreciation to enjoy the constant sight of even a masterpiece, and limitless indeed must be the capacity for artistic feeling in those who can exist day after day in the midst of such confusion of color and form as is to be often seen in the homes of Europe and America. The abode of the unsymmetrical suggests another phase of our decorative scheme. The absence of symmetry in Japanese art objects has been often commented on by Western critics. This, also, is a result of a working out through Zennism of Taoist ideals. Confucianism with its deep-seated idea of dualism, and Northern Buddhism with its worship of a trinity, were in no way opposed to the expression of symmetry. As a matter of fact, if we study the ancient bronzes of China, or the religious arts of the Tang dynasty and the Nara period, we shall recognize a constant striving after symmetry. The decoration of our classical interiors was decidedly regular in its arrangement. The Taoist and Zen conception of perfection, however, was different. The dynamic nature of their philosophy laid more stress upon the process through which perfection was sought than upon perfection itself. True beauty could be discovered only by one who mentally completed the incomplete. The virility of life and art lay in its possibilities for growth. In the tea room, it is left for each guest in imagination to complete the total effect in relation to himself. Since Zennism has become the prevailing mode of thought, the art of the extreme Orient has purposefully avoided the symmetrical as expressing not only completion, but repetition. Uniformity of design was considered fatal to the freshness of imagination. Thus, landscapes, birds, and flowers became the favorite subjects for depiction rather than the human figure, the latter being present in the person of the beholder himself. We are often too much in evidence as it is, and in spite of our vanity, even self-regard is apt to become monotonous. In the tea room, the fear of repetition is a constant presence.